So I'm delighted to be able to share with you some kind of high-level themes from my book. The book was really intended to draw together a lot of parts of our housing problems that often we talk about in silos and help people, not necessarily you all who are experts in the housing world, but help people who are new to housing problems think about this as a system, as lots of different policies and problems that fit together. So I like to start off with a little bit of kind of the fun political context for this. So if you're not familiar with the gentleman in this picture, this is Jimmy McMillan. He is the founder and potentially the only member of the Rent is Too Damn High party. This is in New York, where you can have lots of little splinter parties around single issues. And so he has been raising awareness for many, many years that in New York, of course, the rent has been too damn high pretty much forever. But this is a problem that's now expanded beyond the New Yorks and the San Franciscos, that we are seeing affordability challenges in virtually all parts of the country. And this is particularly difficult for communities that have traditionally been affordable to kind of wrap their heads around. They're not going to stay that way forever, and we need to think more holistically about some solutions. Give a little bit of historical context for how we got to our tight housing markets today. This shows you housing starts adjusted for population going all the way back to about 1970. And of course, we know that the real estate market is very cyclical, that production goes up and down over time, but there's been a steady downward trend for many, many years now. And of course, in the recent past, we faced this cliff during the Great Recession where we just stopped building homes altogether for about 4 or 5 years. People couldn't get mortgages to buy homes. Builders couldn't get loans to build. We had half-finished subdivisions and apartment buildings that were sitting there waiting for capital and waiting to be reoccupied. So the industry essentially just shut down for a while. And it's taken us a very long time to sort of creep back up to the levels of production that we had before the Great Recession. The downside of this is that we are nationally about 3.8 million homes short, meaning we just haven't built enough homes to keep up with population growth and job growth, so there aren't enough homes for people to be in. Obviously, this differs in different parts of the country, so we know that places like California, Seattle, New York, Boston, South Florida have been underbuilding housing for more like 30 to 40 years. So they have just not built enough to keep up with demand, and they're essentially now exporting their problem to the rest of the country because the shortage is so severe. Now, it's not just the problem of the markets. It's not that the construction industry, the development industry can't figure out how to build homes or doesn't want to. We have created much of this problem ourselves through sets of policies and regulations that make it difficult to build housing, and especially to build a diverse range of housing choices in many of our communities. So more than 3/4 of the land, even in large cities, is set aside exclusively for single-family detached homes. Those are the largest kinds of homes. They're the most expensive for people to buy or to rent, and they don't necessarily fit everybody's needs at all points in their life. So by reserving most of our land for single-family detached homes, we have prohibited building attached homes, small apartment buildings, even duplexes and triplexes. Those are just illegal to build in most parts of the country. I like to show people pictures of the kinds of things we used to build before zoning made everything illegal, and think about sort of the transition. If you go to any older neighborhood, any neighborhood where the housing was built before about 1940, you're likely to see a mixture of housing types. So this is a picture of a sixplex from the Fan neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia. That's a neighborhood that has a mixture of some single-family detached, some row houses, and notably a lot of 4 and 6 unit buildings like this that we just used to build all the time. So we would build a whole neighborhood full of 6-unit apartment buildings the way today we build a single-family subdivision. And of course, this provides more homes for more people in a relatively small space. So this is the kind of property that exists in many of our neighborhoods and we take for granted, but actually is illegal to build today. Many of the East Coast cities, this is a picture from Baltimore, have a long tradition of building attached row houses. These are also very efficient structures for housing a lot of people in a small space of land. They work well for both rental and for home ownership. These are some really skinny row houses, about 15 feet wide. Again, this would be illegal to build even in most of the Baltimore neighborhoods where they exist today. We've managed to outlaw the buildings that already exist, as well as outlawing them in other neighborhoods. One of the other things that we used to do before current zoning is that we would put ground floor retail and then put a couple of apartments on top of it. So that accomplishes a couple of different things. It means that people who live in those apartments generally have stores and shops and restaurants that they can go to just downstairs. So people were able to run a lot of their daily errands on foot within a few minutes walk of their house. So that makes for a very convenient lifestyle. This also provides workforce housing, right? People can live directly above where they work. And it makes for very vibrant kinds of neighborhoods. Well, we often think of sort of the older neighborhoods being kind of Midwest and Northeast, but this is actually in San Diego. So even in some of our newer Sunbelt cities, we have these traditions of integrating retail and residential spaces. What are the kinds of neighborhoods that we're allowed to build under current zoning in most of the US? So we build, not only do we require that they are single-family detached homes and other kinds of structures are prohibited, but we have rules that prescribe virtually everything about the homes you can build. So they have to be on the same size piece of land, the same lot, the same size house. You can't build the really small starter homes that we used to build in large numbers. Two-car garage with off-street parking spaces, the same setback from the front and from the sides, the same size yard. So all of this is very rigidly prescribed, which makes it really difficult to provide the kind of diverse neighborhoods that we used to build. And if you think about what this implies for who can live in the neighborhood, right, the homes are all built at the same time, the same size house and piece of land. That also implies that we're going to get more homogeneity in the people who live there, particularly based on their income and wealth. If you have to be able to purchase a single-family home with a mortgage, then that sets a floor for the income needed to get access to these communities. So what we know is that many of these communities wind up having households who have very similar kinds of income and wealth, and lower-income households, particularly who rent homes, are essentially excluded from most of these communities, right, because they're built for owner-occupants. One of the other problems about neighborhoods like this is they don't serve households at all stages of their life particularly well. So this big single-family home with a yard we typically think of as something for families with kids, but it's not necessarily where younger households want to live, right? Because we don't have things like retail nearby. It's also not a great place for people to age in place. Many of us at some point will no longer want to maintain a big house and do yard work all the time. These are neighborhoods that are very car dependent, and so people who have difficulty driving are going to have a really difficult time getting to their doctor's appointments and to the store. We have built a lot of these neighborhoods in ways that are very inflexible over the course of our lifetime, and we see lots of older adults who would love to age in their community, if not necessarily their house, but there's nothing for them to move to, right? There's no one-story accessible living, there are no accessible apartment buildings, and so people have to relocate when they get older. So we talk often about zoning as a set of rules that are written down on paper, and those rules are important, right? So prohibitions on structure types and minimum lot sizes. But we have also evolved over the decades to an approval process that is very discretionary, very ad hoc, where the rules on paper are often just a starting point for negotiation between the elected officials, between the planning department and other agencies, and between the developer who wants to build something. We started off in incorporating community input with the best of intentions. So I suspect there are a bunch of planners in the audience. Planners believe very much that communities should get a voice in what gets built. And we did this from very good intentions, fighting back against things like urban renewal, where whole neighborhoods were destroyed by the government and the communities didn't have any voice. But over time, the community engagement process has really been co-opted by a lot of wealthy and powerful people who live in the community and who use the engagement process as a way to stop development that they don't want. By the way, it turns out often existing residents don't want any new development. They don't want any changes in their neighborhood. They just want to freeze it in amber. So that gives a lot of privilege and a lot of power to people who are already in the community, whereas people who might benefit from new housing, who want to move in, who want to have rental housing that's available, they don't live there yet. So they're not part of the community and often are not welcomed in and not given a space to talk, right? So we have essentially given veto power to the existing residents and frozen out people who want to join those communities. I don't need to tell those of you in this room, you work in the affordable housing space. All of the barriers that I've been talking about apply to market rate housing. When we start talking about affordable housing and subsidies and low-income households, the barriers are that much higher. Show up at a community meeting and say, I want to build luxury apartments, you're going to get yelled at. Show up at a community meeting and say, I want to build affordable apartments for low-income families, and the pitchforks are going to come out for sure. So this process has really made it very, very difficult to build the kind of housing that all of us know we need more of, and especially to build it in high-opportunity communities, in places that have some of the best public school systems, that have access to jobs, that have a healthy environment. So taking some of the power back from wealthy communities and empowering the people that we are here to represent has to be part of the solution. Toby teed up my graph nicely for me. I also steal lots of statistics from the Joint Center's rental housing report. I think it's worth reiterating, though, just what a tight crunch low-income families have. Rents have gone up faster than income for decades now, and this hits hardest for people at the bottom 20 to 25% of the income distribution. So we know that most low-income families do not get any kind of federal housing assistance. Only about 1 in 4 eligible households gets a voucher or space in public housing or spaces in tax credit units. So low-income families are spending more than half of their income every month on the rent. This leaves them maybe $400 left over to spend on food and transportation and everything else for the month. This is not enough to pay for basic necessities, and it's really important to understand that even separate from the restrictions on housing supply, this is essentially a gap in incomes and housing costs. The way to fix the problem of people not having enough money is to give people more money. So we love things like universal basic income. We love just giving people cash and letting them decide, do I need to spend it on the rent? Do I need to fix my car? Do I have a health emergency? We should give people that flexibility that middle-class households take for granted, right? But we have not provided that kind of flexibility and support for low-income households. The flip side of not building enough homes in the right places where people want to live and we have well-paying jobs is that we have built and continue to build too many homes in places that we know are unsustainable. So the fastest growing states in the country are Florida and Texas and South Carolina. We are building a lot of homes in places where we know that they are going to be hit by hurricanes, they are prone to wildfires, to flooding from sea level rise. So we are building homes in places that we know will have to be maintained and rebuilt. And by the way, we're all paying for that already. How many of you have seen your property insurance bills go up? For your homes, for some of the multifamily buildings that you're renting, we are on the verge of having a full-blown insurance crisis. I don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to have to make some decisions quickly because we are going to wind up with some properties that are uninsurable, and that puts people at a lot of risk. So we are that's a whole sort of other conversation, but to keep in the back of your mind, this is one of the components of housing costs that's going up rapidly, and it's likely to continue going up until we make some structural changes. Toby also teed up for us, so this is Fair Housing Month. We know that homeownership can be a very powerful mechanism for wealth building for the people it was designed for and people who have access to it. But homeownership is also essentially the root of our very persistent and large racial wealth gap. Most white households, when they buy their first home, get assistance with the down payment from parents or grandparents. Younger Black and Latino households don't get that kind of support because their parents and grandparents were excluded from homeownership. So we have had federal policies over decades that made it okay to not give mortgages to a subset of people. And so we know that Black and Latino households in particular have been excluded from this wealth building mechanism for many decades. It's really important to understand that even if we were able to get younger households into homeownership at the same rates, right, and we still have a pretty large homeownership gap, that's not immediately going to solve the wealth gap, which has accumulated over decades. Black and Latino households have a harder time qualifying for a mortgage. When they buy, they're more likely to buy in neighborhoods that see lower rates of house price appreciation, and they tend to buy later in the business cycle, so don't get as much of the upswing before moderation. So Black and Latino households have accumulated less home equity, and that just compounds generation after generation. Zoning is only one of a handful of sort of a legacy of policies that communities have used to reinforce economic and racial segregation. So this is a map of redlining. That's obviously one of the historic tools that was used to direct capital towards primarily white neighborhoods and away from Black neighborhoods. Before that, we had racially restrictive covenants until those were struck down. Sometimes I have conversations with sort of disingenuous audiences who say, I don't understand how you can say that zoning is part of the racial segregation. There's nothing in the zoning code that says Black households can't move here. It's like, sure, but if you restrict all of the homes to be large single-family homes on 2-acre lots, Black households are welcome to move here as long as they can buy $1 million house, right? There's nothing discriminatory about that. And of course, part of this is it's legal to discriminate against poor people. And so that's what a lot of our affluent communities are doing by putting into place these restrictions. Local governments have their own set of interests when they think about the development process. In particular, local governments rely very heavily on property taxes to pay for things like schools, parks, libraries, public safety, transportation. So property taxes are inherently a part of the development process. When you transition a piece of land from a parking lot or an open farm into an apartment building or a single-family subdivision, that changes the revenues coming into the local government, and it also changes the demand for public services. It is in fact true that when you build more homes and people move in, you may need more teachers, you may need more classrooms, you have more demands on your public services. So local governments are always doing this calculus to figure out what kind of development pays for itself. Very often, they do sort of a simplistic version of this, which is to say, if I require large houses on large lots that are worth a lot of money, then a 1% property tax will bring in a lot of revenues in terms of cash. Smaller, less expensive properties for the same property tax rate bring in a smaller dollar value of property taxes. Of course, what they're forgetting is that the big houses also tend to bring in larger households who actually use more public services. But we see very often that communities are using this sort of fiscal approach to say, I don't want lower value properties, I don't want smaller homes, and in particular, I don't want subsidized housing. That's seen as often a drain on public revenues, although we know that in fact this provides really essential workforce housing for people who are in the communities already and are performing essential jobs. If we step away from the neighborhood level and the city level to think about what these restrictions on supply are doing to our regional economy, our state economies, our national economy, it's simply holding back growth. We know that employers can't hire and retain workers as well when housing is expensive. So this is an economic development and competitiveness issue. And I say this is particularly true for regions like Des Moines that have traditionally been affordable and have sort of counted on, we can hire people and they'll move here because this is affordable and has a high quality of life. As housing costs go up faster than income, those regions become less competitive. And this is something that also is worth bringing up with your state legislators because it affects not just individual communities, it affects the regional economy overall. So to fix this sort of whole range of problems, we're going to need lots of different policy solutions at all levels of government. Local governments still have the primary authority for writing a lot of the rules around development, what kinds of homes can be built in what locations, how you tie in housing with transportation and economic development. We need to make sure that local governments are allowing a diverse range of structures in every community. Homeownership, rental, a wider range of rents and prices, different kinds of structures that accommodate households of different ages and sizes and needs and preferences. State governments haven't traditionally been really part of the conversation on housing supply. They mostly have sort of administered some of the subsidy programs, but state governments are increasingly realizing that their economies are at risk if individual local governments don't build enough housing to accommodate workforce. And so states are leaning into this idea of, can we nudge local governments to allow more housing, particularly in job corridors, transit corridors, in areas where we have a lot of infrastructure already, can we encourage more development? And I will say one of the most useful things states can do and should do is to provide some help paying for the infrastructure. We know that building more housing requires some support for infrastructure, and states could make it easier for local governments to say yes to offset some of those costs directly, particularly the differences across communities that have older infrastructure that needs maintaining and newer communities that are still building it out. The single most important thing the federal government could do would be just to provide more financial support to low-income households. This is a nationwide problem and a scale that only the federal government can address. The federal government should make housing vouchers an entitlement, so everybody who's poor gets one. We are actually very stingy compared to many other countries, wealthy countries, that just provide housing assistance for everybody and don't fuss about it. I don't have huge hopes that Congress is going to get there, but when you go to Washington next month for your visits with your delegations, make sure to tell your representatives it's their job to support low-income households in Iowa and everywhere else. Would also love to see us tweak the federal tax code to provide more support for people to build wealth outside of homeownership. Many households will just not become homeowners or become homeowners later in life. We should provide support for people to set aside funding through other means and provide tax incentives to do that. None of the policy solutions in my book are my original ideas. Most of them have been floating around for a long time. We know the kinds of policies that would get us better outcomes, but the politics in getting there are just incredibly difficult. Every locality, every state is thinking about its own interest in a fairly short-term way. And so we see over and over again the same debates playing out. We don't want to build enough housing for low-income households. We don't want to provide support for poor people. We don't do the kinds of connections between jobs and infrastructure and housing that we should do because local communities are worried about the very immediate impacts and not thinking about the larger picture. The good news is there are actually signs of hope. There's a lot of policy experimentation going on at the moment that gives us some signs of what we could be pursuing. So stepping back a little bit to think about sort of the state level context, this is showing you housing price appreciation that the Federal Housing Finance Administration puts together for the whole country and updates regularly. So Iowa has a pretty wide range of housing needs across the state. You can see the lighter colored yellow counties are places where housing prices are pretty much flat and in some cases even declining. So we know, for instance, that a lot of the rural communities that have lost population, housing prices going up is actually not the main problem, right? We have some issues with housing quality, but it's not steep affordability. On the other hand, Iowa also has a number of counties where prices are going up quite rapidly. So the top category in the deepest green is over 8%. Most of us didn't get an 8% raise last year from our bosses, right? So prices are going up faster than incomes, and that's going to put pressure on people. If you haven't come across this yet, a couple of years ago, I worked with the National Association of Counties to put together what we call this matchmaker tool that allows you to compare counties to the metro area and to the country and give sort of some context. And we actually put this together partly so that local governments could take this to their state representatives and to their congressional representatives and sort of show, here are our needs and our issues and why we need particular kinds of support. So Polk County and Des Moines are reasonably affordable for middle-income households. That's not something to take for granted. That's actually a great advantage. So middle-income households can mostly afford to buy a home in the metro area. But we do see that about 20% of your renters are severely cost-burdened, spending more than half of their income on rent. That's about similar for the national average, right? So the 20% of people who really need the most support are often the ones we need to focus on. We can see also that Iowa has a relatively old housing stock. So about 16% of homes were built before 1940. These are homes that are going to require some investment in order to stay safe and habitable. And so that's going to be a parallel need to making sure that we're focusing on affordability. We've seen a lot of activity at the state level in the last couple of years, with state governments really leaning into the idea of nudging local governments towards zoning reforms that allow a wider range of housing types to be built. Your neighbors to the north, Minnesota, have passed a lot of funding for sort of direct assistance and building some housing, and they're also debating a number of fairly interesting zoning changes. I haven't heard the latest on that. But we have seen also a really interesting mix politically of the states that are getting involved. So Utah and Montana, both of which are pretty red-leaning states, have stepped in to encourage more development. Utah has a pretty ambitious transit-oriented development package. They're encouraging use of land around their transit stations. They've also been very concerned about overusage of water. So there's some really interesting things coming out of states that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of, just the high-cost coastal states. Lots of local groups have been springing up to put the good kind of pressure on elected officials. Traditionally, elected officials assume that all of their existing homeowners don't want more housing and are going to push back against this. And so part of what we need to do is make sure that there's a counterbalance to that when there's a community meeting and a city council debate, that it's not just the long-standing residents who are saying, keep it the way it is, that we have other voices saying, no, actually, we want more housing in our community. We want rental housing in the community. This is really important. Elected officials are much more inclined to support changes to policies when they think that there are constituents behind them. And so providing that visible and vocal support is really important. Amazingly, Congress has gotten into the game as well. So I spend a fair amount of time in DC talking to members of Congress and their staff. In the last 8 months, 3 separate congressional committees have held hearings on housing supply and what the federal government can do. So Senate Banking, Joint Economic Committee, House Financial Services, all of which have an important role to play. They're very much in fact-finding mode, right? So Congress is hearing from their constituents, affordability is bad, we need to do something. They're not sure what the something is. They've also, the staff have told me, not revealing state secrets here, Congress is probably not going to pass a lot of legislation this year, but this is a great time to be educating them, to be laying out some options, to be helping them think through solutions. The federal government has pretty limited tools on zoning and land use. That's just not their jurisdiction, but they can do things like provide technical assistance to local governments who want to do this, provide some guidance, do some analysis of the early kinds of experiments we're seeing at the state and local level to understand the kinds of policy reforms that could work. So hopefully those will be the kinds of things that they move into. So I wrote this book not necessarily for you guys who are all pros in the field. I suspect I've told you a lot of stuff that you already know. You deal with this in your day-to-day jobs. But there's a big swath of the electorate that's not heavily engaged in housing policy and land use. Lots of people just sort of own their home and they have their jobs and their families and their own lives and haven't really engaged with this. The good news is there are a lot of people out there who don't have deeply held beliefs, which means that we can persuade them, right? And I spend a lot of my time going out and talking to audiences, trying to reach people who are sort of vaguely aware that there's an affordability problem, but don't really know what to do about it. And all of us in our day-to-day jobs, we go about our work, we tend to talk very often to one another. So I joke with my planning students that they talk to other people who are big enthusiasts of public transportation and affordable housing, and we all agree with one another, which is great, but we need to be talking to the people who don't agree with us. It's really powerful to have conversations with people you know. So people who are in your family, people in your communities, who are not part of sort of the urbanist and planning circle, and bringing them on board, helping them understand that some of the things they may think, for instance, about who lives in affordable housing are not true, helping them understand why this is really important as an economic development issue, providing decent quality housing for our kids. These are all issues that affect the well-being of our communities, even if people aren't aware of it. So thank you very much for the work that you do. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and I look forward to your questions.